be part of this program. As we're at the end, I'm going to talk about all the places where I got sources, and if you have any questions or you want to know more about a particular thing, I think that would be wonderful. I have all of the research that I did, and I would be happy to share it with you. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. I call my presentation Towards Maximum Efficiency, Erie Proving Ground and Ohio's Struggle to Win a Global War. The call came in on a biting Wednesday morning in February of 1944. The chief of the Ordnance Depot in the car in Ohio, Major Robert E.L. Masters, a handsome 41-year-old with a Clark Gable mustache, received the order. A massive supply of artillery pieces was needed in the European Theater of Operations. Although he had been stationed at this place for less than a month, he knew that he needed to get on this directly, so he's going to immediately assign employees to begin this work. It was a very, very complicated process, and it would take all of the parts of the industrial complex located on the shores of Lake Erie. Before the weapons that are going to be produced in every part of the United States could be shipped to the battlefield, they had to be tested. They had to be sure that they would be firing accurately and that they would not blow up in the faces of the soldiers on the battlefield. There were many proofing and many testing sites in the United States, but this small site, with its long-range capabilities, was the preferred testing sites for artillery pieces such as howitzers, mortars, and tank guns. After each new or reconditioned weapon was fired, they're going to be prepared for this long voyage. They're going to be protected against salt and moisture, and those things could just wreak havoc on these pieces of delicate machinery. They would then be crated into boxes, and they would be shipped to the spur line where they could go for transport. At 5:30 the same day, another call came into the depot, clarifying those initial orders. The emergency shipment would need to be ready for transport the very next day. Many of the employees had already returned home to their homes in the neighboring community. All of them that were called agreed to return. There were 6 female ordnance workers that were still in the administrative offices. They were waiting for their ride home. All of them were set back to work. Less than 12 hours later, 326 pieces of military artillery, howitzers, tank guns, mortars, they had been test fired, they had been shipped into packaged into crates, and they were ready to be shipped overseas. The order was 100% complete. Although the frantic pace of that February order was noteworthy, it was neither the first time nor the last time that the employees of this ordnance facility would be pressed to fill an emergency order. Another call is actually going to come in later that week, and workers are going to have to travel through a snowstorm and work a 15-hour day to package and ship 391 pieces of artillery. As military forces are going to be going through the Italian countryside on the road towards Rome, the men and women that were employed by the Ordnance Depot at this location worked increasingly long shifts under very hazardous conditions to supply the artillery pieces and armament that would win the battles, and eventually they would help win the war. The site where Major Masters was stationed played a crucial role in the victory over the Axis powers during World War II. While its role in history has largely been forgotten, and many of the buildings at this site have been demolished, Erie Proving Ground was enormously impactful on the international, local, and individual levels during its years of operation. It became the second largest ordnance depot in the United States, and it experienced a 10,000% increase in employment between 1940 and 1943. According to government data, 70% of the mobile artillery used by the United States armies and its allies, Russia, France, Great Britain, all of it came through Erie Proving Ground. While its importance as a military facility is unmistakable, it was also extremely important to the surrounding communities and the people that work there. Erie Proving Ground was unique because it had a diversity of experiences in one single location. It is a place where soldiers, diplomats, female ordnance workers, prisoners of war, and the local community came together to defeat a very dangerous enemy. The involvement of each of these groups was absolutely necessary for the successful completion of this objective. Their work during this period is characterized by sacrifice, by people working really long hours under dangerous conditions, and they are going to put their lives, their health, and very important relationships at risk in order to complete this objective. And I can't tell you how many divorce notices I read because of all the hours these people had to work. It was a lot. This is also the story of a community whose trajectory was forever changed by this conflict, and where the consequences can still be felt 2 generations later. The tremendous output accomplished at Erie Proving Ground during the Second World War was possible only because of the complete integration of the community, the workers, and the ordnance officials into the mission of supplying the artillery and armament that would win the Second World War.
Can I ask a basic question?
Oh my gosh, some of those went for, of course.
Where was this?
I just realized that thank you.
I'm sorry.
So, no, not at all. So this is going to be Port Clinton, and this is going to be Oak Harbor. So if you go to the, to Camp Perry,
Yeah.
on that road, it was right next to Camp Perry.
Okay.
And
I wondered about that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I just realized that I loaded up the wrong slideshow. So I'm not going to have all the pictures that I really wanted to show you, but we're going to make do as best as we can. So I'm going to have to talk a little bit about the history of the Ordnance Depot in the United States in order for you to understand what's going on. So the Ordnance Department of the United States is going to be founded in 1812. And what their job was is they had to procure armament, guns, ammo for the United States Army. They are also going to have to interface with private individuals in order to develop these guns. So, like, I'm a history teacher. When I talk about Eli Whitney, it's usually going to be in regards to the cotton gin. He did more than that. He also helped to develop rifles that had interchangeable parts. That was a big thing for the United States Army. Now, during the Civil War, the Ordnance Department is going to really face a lot of challenges as they're trying to outfit the largest military force that in the United States that they had ever assembled. There's going to be some tragic accidents along the way. And in particular, there were a couple of explosions where women ordnance workers were killed. They knew that they needed to develop a place where you could test these machines. A proving ground at Sandy Hook, New Jersey was constructed in 1874, and there's going to be followed by another one in Aberdeen, Maryland, which is going to be constructed later. The one at Aberdeen is going to be the largest ordnance facility in the United States and is still a very important place even today. Now, during the early 1900s, we're going to have this move towards urbanization, this move towards industrialization. And that same move is going to be reflected in the Ordnance Department of the United States. They needed to have a place where they could test these weapons. And unfortunately, we didn't do a very good job in World War I. In World War I, the United States Army ordered 10,000 pieces of artillery that could be shipped overseas to help the doughboys. A grand total of 143 of them were tested and were shipped over there and made it to the battlefield. They were not ready. They knew they needed to do a better job. But the Ordnance Department during World War I had begun to experience just tremendous rates of growth. They had increased their officers by 6,000%. The number of enlisted men that were part of the Ordnance Branch had grown by almost 5,000%. As part of this expansion, they began looking for a facility where they could devote to long-range artillery testing. Now, a location in northern Ohio is going to be eventually selected for this work. The establishment of Camp Perry. The creation of Camp Perry and Erie Proving Ground are inextricably linked. And I'm sure you guys have all heard the story about how Camp Perry, how that location was told. And I learned it from Peggy Debian, sitting right up here. They knew that they needed to have a bigger site where they could do larger movements, where they could have these rifle matches. And Ammon Critchfield is going to be a duck hunter, and he's going to find this perfect location. And when they first came here, when they first looked at this area, it wasn't exactly the best location. It's going to be, you know, a lot of wildlife, but a lot of it's going to be swamp. It's not going to be the best. Now, the local residents completely understood this. They thought that they were crazy for building on this location. But as often happens, they ignored the input of the local people, and they decided to purchase this anyhow. So despite the disadvantages that this location had, it actually has a lot of advantages to it. Right during World War II, or during World War I in 1916, there was a very large shipment depot in New Jersey. It was called the Black Tom Railroad. This place was actually bombed by German officers, and there was a tremendous explosion. This facility in northern Ohio, they didn't have to worry about that. It was very, very isolated. It was also very close to major manufacturing centers in Cleveland and Toledo. There was also a great rail line. It was also had unlimited area for expansion, and most importantly, there was the very large expanse of the lake water where they could do all of this testing. Well, unfortunately, I don't have all of my pictures, but I will after we get done with this, I will try and load my original one up here so that you guys can see it. I have a lot of pictures of the growth and the original construction of Erie Ordinance Depot. So the project along the lake shore was originally envisioned as being much smaller than it became. The first plans said that it was going to be a place where they could test 50 guns per day, and it would only cost $3 million. Now, naturally, it's a government project, so it ends up being much bigger and much more expensive than they had originally planned. Later, the plans are going to be expanded to include 50 more guns and an additional budget of $2 million. Now, a construction quartermaster is going to make the journey to this area in May of 1918, and he says, nope, this isn't going to work. Even though Camp Perry was only a decade old, it was still not going to have the capacity to support a place that was going to be so large. The infrastructure in place at Camp Perry was not aging well. The sewer lines, the water lines, all of the lighting, all of that was at capacity, and it would not help the workforce. The land next to Camp Perry came under consideration for creating a separate facility. This, of course, is also going to be very problematic land. 300 of the 1,200 acres that were purchased, 300 of them were swamp land. They could not do anything with it. It was also inhabited by wildlife. If they needed to do this, they were going to have to immediately bring about ditches and drainage in order to make the site workable. Despite all of these problems, they are going to purchase 1,250 acres of land for about $350,000 in March of 1918. Now, this immediately differentiates it from Camp Perry. Erie Proving Ground is owned by the federal government. Camp Perry is owned by the state of Ohio. The name is also going to be changed. It had originally been called Camp Perry Proving Ground, but it's going to then be called Erie Proving Ground. This is going to be the first time that the name is going to change. And as a historian, that was the worst thing to deal with in the entire world, because when I went to the National Archives to do all of my research, I had to search about 12 different names trying to find the right one. Luckily, I did find it eventually. And I did find just substantial records showing how they built this, different pictures of the buildings. There's also going to be lots of problems during construction, and there were fights about how things were made, and there were problems with contractors. It was made for really fascinating reading. Only a short time later, notices are going to appear in the newspapers, warning that a danger zone on the lake had been established. Within 1 year, the proof firing of heavy artillery had commenced. There were howitzers ranging from 75 millimeter all the way up to 240 millimeter that were going to be test fired into the lake. And we have up here, provided by Gary Finke, one of the shells, and that's a 75 millimeter? 75. So think of how big these things were. They were absolutely huge. And when I was doing research here, people were telling me that you could actually tell the caliber. You could tell the caliber of the guns that they were firing by how much they shook the school windows. That's how much of a mark it made on the community. During this initial phase of work, 35 warehouses, 3 officer houses, 4 non-commissioned officer houses, a barracks, and a hospital with an isolation unit were constructed. Water for this facility was brought in for the lake, and it was pumped through filters. And by the time that the construction was completed in 1919, the depot was valued at $5,300,000. Now, the employment at Erie Proving Ground was substantial during these early years. There were, in the beginning, there were about 839 people that helped to construct the rail yards, the power supply, all of this stuff. But as World War I ended, the facility is going to be shifted to work more towards storage. And it's going to change from being a proving ground to being an ordnance depot. By 1921, the number of employees had fallen to 209. 3 years later, there were only 56 employees at Erie Proving Ground. Now, during these interwar years, a decision was made to add new hospital facilities. And I'll show you a picture of it later. The original hospital that they had built at Erie Proving Ground was very small. It was like a row of 3 smaller buildings that were connected. They had an isolation unit. And they actually saw some work during the influenza epidemic of 1918. But less than a decade later, they were in terrible shape. It was so bad that when the person that was in charge of Erie Proving Ground viewed them, they said, this isn't going to work. And they completely remake the hospital. And it's a beautiful brick building that I'll show you the pictures of. It's going to come in, and get this is amazing. It's going to come in $6,000 under budget when they build it. I've never heard of that happening before. This hospital would be an essential resource for the people in the area. During World War II, they would receive people that were wounded in accidents would receive treatments in the wards. Car crash victims, and there were a lot of car crashes, they would be brought to the hospital at Erie Proving Ground. Babies were even born there. Now, in 1935, the Works Progress Administration is going to begin 7 years of improvement at Camp Perry and at Erie Proving Ground. They're going to make new mess halls and new industrial buildings. They're going to pave the roads that are going in and out of this area. They're also going to start to beautify the landscape, increase drainage, and modernize the communication system. All things that are going to be very important. So we had a bad time figuring out how to test our arms and armament during World War I. And this is something that we're going to actually learn our lesson as we're going towards World War II. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, during those interwar years, he is going to authorize the creation of an industrial mobilization plan. And he's going to have this plan in place so that we as a nation can utilize our industrial capacity in order to help us if there's ever another emergency. They hope that this would never be used, but obviously this is going to prove very prescient for them within the next decade. September of 1939 is going to see the invasion of Poland by the armies of Germany under Adolf Hitler, leading to the outbreak of World War II in Europe. President Roosevelt is going to respond to this aggressive action with a multi-layered strategy that would increase United States preparedness and give the nations allied against the Axis powers more tools to fight. The protective mobilization plan was proposed by Roosevelt a week after the invasion of Poland. We did not want to enter the war as a combatant yet, but we were able to frame this preparation as a response to a limited emergency, and that allowed them to increase our spending on defense without actually getting involved in the war. Because of this plan, facilities such as Erie Proving Ground began to experience tremendous growth in both employees and in their industrial activities. It was originally hoped that France and Germany would be able to stop Adolf Hitler. Unfortunately, it was not meant to be. And England was soon left as the only people that were fighting, well, the only nation that could fight against Adolf Hitler. And all of their artillery was destroyed during the Blitz. Not all of it, but the greatest majority of it was. In desperation, they are going to turn to the United States for aid. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 is going to allow the United States to lend arms, armament, artillery to Great Britain based on their need rather than on the ability to pay. In Ottawa County, the effects of that agreement are going to be felt immediately. Erie Proving Ground is going to be officially reactivated in February of 1941, and there's going to be a flurry of new construction. He is going to approve $200,000 for the proposed renovation of buildings, roads, utilities. And there's also going to be the immediate increase of employees at the site. 1940, there were 45 employees at EPG. January of 1941, the number had risen to 175. 1942 saw a massive increase, with the employee population raising to 3,712. By the end of the war, the number of civilian employees was nearing 5,000. It was a huge increase. An expansion of the buildings at Erie Proving Ground was also undertaken. By 1943, the number of structures had swelled to 374. It was a huge place back then. These included offices, warehouses, living quarters, shops, and utility buildings. When the work was completed, Erie Proving Ground had become the nexus that supplies artillery to the United States and to its allies. By January of 1941, the people of Northwest Ohio were already witnessing the changes that were going on at the industrial facility in Locarno. Although official entry into World War II was almost a year away, the buildings were being erected at a frantic pace, and the firing of all of the guns was already underway. In the following year, the buildings and employees at Erie Proving Ground were ready to begin the monumental work which would characterize their labor until the end of the war. The artillery, material, and metal plate being produced throughout the United States began to arrive by rail and truck for assembly before the items were shipped to their eventual destinations. They are also going to achieve their first award for excellence, and this is something that is going to be repeated for the next 3 years. The year 1943 is going to mark the end of the tooling up phase of the industrialization of the American war machine. From this moment until the end of the war, the United States would be engaged in ground combat. Furthermore, it had emerged as the arsenal of democracy, which President Roosevelt had proposed 3 years later. By this time, Erie Proving Ground had gained international recognition as a partner in the fight against Adolf Hitler. And unfortunately, I don't have the slide out there, but there was a British colonel who was involved in this fight. And he came and he asked to visit Erie Proving Ground when he came over from England. And he said that there was a specific instance where they were fighting General Rommel in Africa. And they're like, we need more artillery, we need more mortars and howitzers and things like that. And they asked Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. said, well, we could get them, but there's no way we can do it in time. But Washington still called Erie Proving Ground, and they said it was absolutely incredible that it was considered impossible, but Erie Proving Ground did it. And they were able to supply those guns that went directly to fight against Erwin Rommel in Africa. That is the kind of connections and the kind of impact that we made. So one of the people that was in this fight that actually worked at Erie Proving Ground and then later went into active service, he said when he was writing home and writing to some of his friends, he said that he had never appreciated the impact that they made. But as a soldier, he could see how much the artillery and armament meant. And he said, that's the Battle of EPG. And that is important, and you guys need to be proud of what you're doing. So I called this section the Battle of Erie Proving Ground. The first week of 1943 saw a dramatic rise in the volume of orders received and the rigorous schedule that tested the endurance of workers as they struggled to keep up with this demanding pace. During 1 week in that year, 350 truckloads of ordnance material arrived at this location, along with 79 railroad cars and 62 truckloads of armor plate. In addition, 12 express trucks and 93 vehicles were loaded with material from various locations and driven to the proving ground. The volume of material that was expected to be tested, to be shipped, was just unprecedented, and they simply could not keep up with it. As all of this is going on, there are also the people that were going to work here were going to be constantly winnowed by the draft. People that were the experienced workers, the experienced people who were used to the testing and to the very minute calibrations of these materials. They were going to be sent away in the draft. Who are they going to hire? Well, they're going to rely on the labor of three different groups of individuals. And I want to touch on each one of them just a little bit. The first one is going to be women. They're going to increasingly hire numbers of women. They're going to be in there for support roles in the beginning. One EPG employee, her name was Gladys Miller, was hired into the tool crib. She would be the person that would hand out hammers, raincoats, and saws to the employees. She wrote weekly letters to her fiancé, and they're going to vividly describe the hardships of working during wartime. During the periods when the production is just going to be out of control, she had to work 16-hour days with no break for weeks on end. In one letter, dated January 13th, 1943, Gladys details the changing nature of her employment. We've been busy for the past 2 days. Monday, we weren't busy enough, so they gave us our first lesson on sharpening saws. The boss asked us, and we could hardly say no. They also told us later on that there would only be the two of us to run the saw sharpener and the tool crib. Sounds like we might be busy. Our foreman is going to try to convince the boss that sharpening saws isn't a woman's job. Better wish him luck. I'd like to know if I could do it. Later on, she could do it. Women were constantly being put into new roles at EPG. The guards that were stationed at the entrance, as the people that were there were needed in other parts of the facility, they trained women to do it. So they would give them pistols, which was kind of a scandal back then. They gave them flashlights. They also gave them Tommy guns. And in the paper, they described them as being real sharpshooters. And they also started to really make a lot of money for doing this. Another lady that was from Minnesota, she's going to actually make quite a bit of money. She's going to go from being a typist to being a junior clerk, and her salary is going to raise all the way up into $1,400. Another female employee is going to earn $750 in her first year of work. And this is a considerable amount back then. A Ford Special Coupe is going to retail for about $780. By the end of the war, her annual salary was $1,948. That reflects the amount of hours that she was forced to work during those years. Now, in 1943, the ordnance officials were confident that they had unlocked the secrets of managing the blended workforce at Erie Proving Ground. In an article entitled Ordnance Knows Women, they are going to detail their findings in the newsletter, The Echo. And it said, women have greater finger dexterity than men, greater patience, and greater enthusiasm. Women will accept 99% of the responsibility, but they always like to receive a final okay on their work from a man. Women want their jobs glamorized for them. Women do not mind getting their hands and faces dirty, but the lack of beauty shops in the community will cause a serious personnel problem. Women take instructions and directions in a far more personal manner than men. Women are patriotic without cynicism. So, gentlemen, they had already figured out women in 1943, so you should just take notes.
Shop around the corner, we're all right.
So there's going to be a lot of employment data that is going to be published in the Erie Proving Ground Echo. And I was able to take the data that was published in the 1st of June, 1945, and I was able to complete a map showing where people came from. And if you look at this, the darkness is going to show the number of people that sent employees to Erie Proving Ground. So if you look around, places like Port Clinton, Oak Harbor, Fremont, they're going to send a lot of people. But as you look farther out, and these are people that are commuting to Erie Proving Ground every single day, the colors are going to get lighter as it goes off because people didn't want to drive that far. But if you look, there's an exception. Right over here in Toledo. Toledo sends a significant number of people to Erie Proving Ground every day. And there's a reason for that. They're African Americans. I was able to go back and I looked at all of the newsletters, and the vast majority of the people that traveled from Toledo to Erie Proving Ground were African Americans, and they had a very compelling reason for this. So Executive Order 8802 says that in defense industries, you cannot discriminate against somebody because of race or national origin. So that meant they are going to be earning the same rate as other people. But in Toledo, they still had difficulty finding employment. However, because of the excessive need at Erie Proving Ground, they were hiring these people, and they treated them well enough that many of them are going to stay working here, embracing that commute every single day. With the exception of the living quarters at EPG, and unfortunately because of time, I don't have enough time to go into this, but there were living quarters there. That was the only place that there was racial segregation. African Americans were included in every part of Erie Proving Ground. They're in the Echo, they're in the newsletter. They are a valued part of their community, and I can see this by looking at the newsletters. The African Americans inclusion, the inclusion of African Americans is going to be from the beginning. African Americans were frequently interviewed for a feature called Let's Get Acquainted. In these articles, employees are pictured next to their responses to a question. For example, in July 1st of 1943, James Brooks is going to discuss his plans for summer vacation. He states that he works as a caretaker for his church and enjoys photography. Bob Howe, who's going to be this gentleman down here, he is a tractor operator. He is going to be the person that's going to move these large guns into positions on the firing line. And he's going to be the one that takes them there and he returns them for processing. In an article from 1944, he is going to talk about his career as a vaudeville entertainer. And he's a show business person. He actually performed with Al Jolson, which I thought was great. They also talk about his wife, who is a former school teacher, and they talk about his children, one of whom was a second lieutenant who was lost at sea. Even more surprising, in 1946, they do another article on Bob Howe, and it mentions that he is running for mayor of Sepia City, which is a historically black community, like an organization in Toledo. He is soliciting for votes among the workers at Erie Proving Ground. The article talks about the fact that he was an important member of the NAACP in Toledo. They allowed him to advertise this in the Erie Proving Ground Echo. Very interesting also, as was common during the time, if you went to one of the Port Clinton newspapers or one of the Fremont newspapers, if somebody was in there and they were an African American, they would designate them that way. It would be James, or it would be Bob Howe, African American, or another word. That never happens in the Echo, not a single time. And in another article, they talk about fishing. They're very much included. The sports teams at Erie Proving Ground were completely integrated by 1945. There are examples of 4 teams, men and women, where it is African American and white people that are playing together on the same team. I have never heard of that happening anywhere else but here. They're also going to be questioned about their feelings about things like World War II and about what they're doing for the summer. So hopefully this goes to show that these people were valued and they were part of this community, and because of that, they were treated very, very well. Now, the prisoners of war. This is going to be a pretty famous part of the workforce at Erie Proving Ground. So despite the utilization of women, despite the number of people that were coming from Toledo, there was still a terrible labor shortage at Erie Proving Ground. So the government decided that they would do exactly what they had done over in places like Great Britain. They were going to use the prisoners of war. Thousands of these people had been transported to the United States beginning in 1942. Those who demonstrated their commitment to helping the Allies, as long as they passed background checks, they were allowed to volunteer for service. These battalions were able to have distinctive uniforms, they were able to have privileges, and they would get a little bit of pay for it. And these units are going to solve the persistent manpower problem at Erie Proving Ground. By the end of the war, Italian and German prisoners are going to be utilized in the plant and in the surrounding community. In Erie Proving Ground, the ISU workers worked alongside the other employees to meet their production goals. And in the memos, they have all of these memos talking about the rules and regulations. They didn't want them near weapons. They didn't want them interacting with the people. And certainly they did not want them fraternizing with the normal people. I can tell you that that was absolutely ignored at Erie Proving Ground. Fraternization was more like the rule rather than the exception. They were, especially the Italian prisoners of war, they were definitely treated differently than the German prisoners. The Germans were viewed with a little bit more suspicion, and they tended to hold themselves apart. The people loved the Italian prisoners of war. Part of that might have been that Italy had already surrendered by the time that they began to be utilized. The relationships that they formed, their exposure to the American way of life, are going to be very, very important. Gladys Miller was one of the female ordnance workers who worked closely with the Italian service units. Born near Fremont, Ohio, Gladys was a recent high school graduate. Like many women faced with economic hardships, Gladys decided to go to work. In 1942, she took the civil service exam and started at Erie Proving Ground. She rented an apartment in Fremont that allowed her to share a ride to the factory daily, and she began saving for after the war. Gladys seldom mentioned the Italian prisoners of war in letters to her fiancé, but they were unquestionably on friendly terms. When Gladys left Erie Proving Ground to be married in 1945, the prisoners and another employee, Lily Tunnington, took up a collection and purchased a wedding gift for Gladys. It was a gold-plated brooch set with blue stones. That gift became a treasured family heirloom, and her granddaughter is wearing it today. Gladys's friend, Lily Tunnington, was also very close to the other prisoners. She continued to send letters to Gladys after she left work, and she wrote these amazing, chatty, gossipy letters, and they really show how close she was with these people. She was very much a mother figure. In these letters, Lily writes that she purchased leather jackets to help keep the Italian boys warm. She also purchased bags of unroasted coffee to send with them when they went home because she knew how much that cost back in Italy. She treated them very, very well, and they are going to just have amazing close relationships. When the Italian service units are going to return home, they're going to continue to write Lily Tunnington, and they do actually write Gladys Miller, who was my grandmother, even after she returns home. And in one of them, they talk about how many of them wanted to return back to the United States. And the one that my grandmother talked about the most was Luigi Risi. And I did find records of somebody that came and settled in New Jersey from Italy in the very early 1950s, whose name was Luigi Risi. So we don't know if that's exactly the right person, but I like to think that it was. Now I want to talk a little bit about a short instance that happened in, how's my time going?
Oh, you're good.
Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about a short instance because it actually happened in Oak Harbor. And I'm going to give you a very abbreviated account of this. Not everything was perfect. It would be remiss of me as a historian to suggest that everything was always great between the workers and the management. That simply doesn't happen. One instance in particular shows that they pushed these people to work. They had nothing against being dishonest occasionally, against using guilt to encourage them to work. One particular instance happened because of a snowstorm. This is going to be in January of, it was either 1944 or 1945. There was a terrible snowstorm that hit during the day. It was so bad that the workers didn't realize it until they left to go home. And the workers were traveling down 19 to Fremont. And it ended up being, the snow was so bad. And I'm not talking the kind of snowstorms that they cancel school for now. This was a blizzard. It was a horrible blizzard. It was so bad that over a mile of cars got stuck. And in the newspaper articles that they talk about it, each newspaper paints a slightly different picture. So the ones from Oak Harbor, they talk about how it's a local issue. You have people that stopped at the Hasselbach's farm on Route 19. There was 125 people that spent the night there. They talk about, yeah, I know, right? I passed that on the way in here. It was great. They talk about how the workers were wonderful and they were uncomplaining even as they ate the farmers out of house and home. The ones from Port Clinton, they talk about how brave the soldiers were. The soldiers were up all night getting ready to come and rescue them, and they were going to do all of this stuff. But then you compare that to the classified records of what actually happened, and it paints a completely different picture. Because even though the soldiers found out what was happening, they didn't find out till the next morning. And when they try to bring the snow fighting equipment to get all of these stuck people and stuck vehicles out, when they find out that the people stranded in there want to go home rather than go back to work, they left them there. They turned around and they left them there. And they were not happy. But the person that was in charge of public relations went back to Erie Proving Ground and he wrote a couple stories talking about the bravery and about the soldiers doing this great job, and he sent them to all the newspapers. And that's the story that they published. I know, right? I was just shocked when I read that.
What was that picture? I don't have that. What was that picture? I couldn't tell. What's that picture of? Besides the snow.
Oh, I will. After this, I will show you all the pictures. I'm so sorry. I wish I would have put the right one on. It's 200 workers. This is going to be the howitzers that are covered by strippable film. So, in 1946, the staff and the employees at Erie Proving Ground are going to celebrate an Army Day open house. This is after the war is over. It was held on a brisk April morning, and they planned this small event to really showcase the close cooperation between the community and the facility that had existed during the war. The planning committee that was in charge of this celebration was composed of Army officials, employees, and they thought, yeah, maybe about 500 individuals are going to come. However, over 3,000 people are going to show up from the local community. Those that had worked in Erie Proving Ground brought their families to show them where they had worked. The people who had not been there for a decade or more came to see all the amazing expansion that had taken place. And it was just an amazing celebration. During this time, bands are going to play. There's going to be a firing demonstration. The people are going to ride in the vehicles that are used by the ordnance officials. They're going to take them around in the jeeps and the tanks and all that. It was great. And they're going to take rides on the train that moved the heavy artillery pieces into line. The highlight of this festival is going to happen when Colonel Francis Rundle, the commanding officer who had shepherded Erie Proving Ground through the crisis of the last years, is going to take the stage for a special presentation. The retiring colonel distributed bronze stars to 2 members of EOD's personnel for their actions during the war. Then, in a very poignant moment, the colonel is going to pin a silver star on the second grade coat, on the coat of a second grader whose father was Harold Collins of the 192nd Tank Battalion. And this is going to, for me, this is going to symbolize what Erie Proving Ground was about and what they had learned during the war. They had expected a very small gathering, but they planned it well. They knew what they needed to do. When this massive influx of people came to this festivity, they were able to be flexible. They were able to move together, and they were able to make this amazing celebration happen. As I have hopefully demonstrated during this lecture, the men and women who labored at this location had a profound impact on the largest war in human history. The amount of work accomplished at Erie Proving Ground was astronomical. The official records of Erie Proving Ground contain a summary of this achievement. Erie Proving Ground workers have received, processed, proof-shipped, and fired about 70% of all the mobile field artillery for the United States Army and for its allies under Lend-Lease. Although this number is incredible, the often repeated nature of this statistic really dulls its magnitude. We can only understand this by looking at the broader picture. The tanks and artillery pieces that stopped the advance at Alamein were tested and checked for accuracy at Erie Proving Ground. 7 out of every 10 howitzers used for the invasion of Normandy came from Erie Proving Ground. The employees of Erie Proving Ground could look to the invasion of Berlin and see the fruits of their labor. When they read reports of the Battle of the Bulge in newspapers and on films, they could remember those crazy days during December and early January when their workload seemed endless and they could claim a special part of the glory for themselves. In this way, the men and women of Erie Proving Ground were with Montgomery in Africa. They were with Eisenhower in the Normandy invasion. They were with Patton as he crossed the Rhine, and they were with Zukov when he came into Berlin. Now, I want to thank all of you so much for coming and paying attention to me. I love talking about this. This is very much a labor of love. But I'd also like to end with a request. This work that I've done, this research, it is very slowly making its way into becoming a book, and I believe it should be made into a book. This is important stuff here. But if you have family records, if you knew somebody that worked at EPG, please, please consider sharing this with me. I had the very good luck of being the granddaughter of the world's biggest pack rat. Bless you, Grandma. Thank you so much. I have all of her letters from her time at EPG. I have the card that the Italian prisoners of war gave her along with this pen. I actually have the receipt for it showing how much they gave. If you have something similar, please consider sharing it so I can take a look. I'd love to be able to tell their story. Thank you guys. And do you have any questions for me? Yeah.
Most of the stuff, was it shipped out by rail or was some of
it was taken out by air. Like that one shipment that I talked about in the very beginning, that was taken out by air, but most of it was taken out on the railroad.
But nothing through Lake Erie?
Some of it I believe was. They used it all. It was such a huge volume. It really became one of the busiest places. Like they talk about the wear and tear on the roads around here. They actually had to increase the size of the roads and they had to strengthen the bridges because of the size of all the trucks that were going through.
Yeah.
Right? Isn't that amazing? All right, do you have any other question? Yeah.
Were there any accidents out there?
So many.
Lots.
So many.
Really?
When I was doing research at the National Archives, they had this one shell similar to that size that blew unexpectedly. And luckily nobody was killed, but they were seriously injured. And I thought it was hilarious because as I was reading this, one of the librarians looked over and was like, oh, is that a flower? No, that's a shell being blown to bits. Yeah, there were lots of accidents out there.
And, were they manufacturing their own ordnance out there for
They
the
weren't-
testing? Or?
They weren't really manufacturing, it was mostly testing. They would assemble it, but most of it would be done at, the different testing facilities in the United States. And I have a great graphic showing where all of it comes in. But places like, the Singer Manufacturing and all of these different places would ship it all here. They would test it if there were any changes that needed to happen or things that were wrong. Because remember, most of the people that were making this stuff, a lot of them were amateurs too. So some of them had never worked in a manufacturing plant. So if there was anything wrong, they would work with the manufacturers to try and fix it. So they didn't do a lot of manufacturing of it, but they did do a lot of the fixing and a lot of the interfacing with it. So they were on the phone a lot with these places. All right, any other questions?
I think maybe over in Plumbrook, they manufactured some of this gunpowder.
Yeah, they did.
Because they burned some buildings down because they were so full of gunpowder, they couldn't do anything with them.
Yeah.
So whether that came to Erie, I have no idea.
Yeah, actually some of it did.
What are these things made out of? Lisa and I were just thinking, man, all the stuff that landed in the lake.
Yeah, it's a problem. And
What
that's
are they made out of?
Mostly steel.
Yeah.
That's a
Is
steel.
there lead
steel
in it?
dummy room.
I will say I did go out to Camp Perry, and Gary Finke also showed me around where Erie Proving Ground was. If you ask them about it, the people that are at Camp Perry, they're not real friendly. They really do not want to talk about all the stuff that they put in the lake. No, from my perspective, did they put a lot of shells into the lake? Yes, but you have to keep in mind that we were fighting Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime.
I'm
So
not making a judgment. I'm
Yeah.
just asking a question.
all right. Anybody else?
There has been a few times.
Yeah,
where
Bob.
we've actually, through the years, gone out and
Answer
dredged
sort of her
the-
question,
Oh,
well, it was
Spent
probably a little
ammunition,
less than 10 years ago that they did a survey,
They've
yeah.
done
and
it
they checked the bottom of the
things.
lake, and I was shocked to see the amount of,
Unexploded
Some
ordnance
are
that was in the
unexploded.
lake.
Some
and
unexploded, yeah.
we're right in front of Davis Bessie too, and we
Oh,
had
yeah.
unexploded ordnance roll up on the beach last
I
year.
actually gave this presentation at the Ohio Academy of History, and somebody came up to me later and said that he was part of a crew that were actually surveying the bottom, looking for the original site of the the ship, Camp Perry or Commodore Perry's ship that went down. And they found it, and they were going to do stuff, but then they realized that all those little things around it were all live rounds. So they haven't done much there. All right, well, I'm going to put up on my computer any of the pictures that I meant to show you, and unfortunately, because of a technical difficulty, I didn't. So if you would like to see them, but again, thank you so much for listening to me. I love talking about this stuff. So it's such an important story, and it's a shame that this has been largely forgotten. So thank you so much.
Yeah, good job.